Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and my co-host is Jordan Dye, a guy who knows an awful lot about sustainability issues. It doesn't come as a surprise that clean water access is a big problem for people in developing countries. In the global north, however, we take for granted turning on a tap and having water, clean water, come out. In fact, we probably don't even think about it unless there's a drought alert or a pipe burst or some contamination scare that makes the headlines or a natural disaster. But freshwater availability is a sustainability issue that should be on everybody's radar. So, Jordan, what do you think is the biggest freshwater issue that we face?
I think the biggest issue that we face is our entire approach to it. We treat it like a renewable resource that replenishes in our lifetime or even quicker in a lot of cases when you hear people talk about it. And water replenishes on a geological timescale. All of the fresh water we have access to now through aquifers and in our lifetime is all the fresh water we have. And I think so that fundamental mischaracterization of the resource in our minds leads to a lot of the problems that I think we see coming down the road.
I think that's an excellent answer.
Thanks, Kimberly.
Yeah. And because that really is, because when we look at water usage, how quickly, especially when we look at the comparisons between water usage rate between people in global north and global south, or water usage rate for manufacturing, and the fact that manufacturing used to happen in global north countries. Well, water usage in global north countries has dropped, but why? Well, it's because manufacturing was offshored and outsourced to China and Mexico and other emerging economies, where now their water usage, what it looks like and reflects, just like the same what we talked about with carbon dioxide emissions. It's the same exact thing. Where that manufacturing happens, they get dinged for the excess use, when in fact, it's really the goods that are being exported that account for that.
100%. I think you see the same problems on emissions too. In a lot of cases, when we've exported these manufacturing of the good, it's not that we always necessarily export the manufacturing process we use here, which, again, because of regulations and because of technology, might be a lot more strict, which then leads to less resource use. So it's shipping it over and then doing it in a way that leads to a greater footprint than if it had even been done here. And so, yeah, the concept of a water footprint and how much water are you importing and shifting around the globe is something that's really important and doesn't get as much conversation as, carbon footprints.
Well, and the thing is, though, that when we actually talk about industrial usage of water, that's only about 20% of fresh water that we're talking about. The overwhelming majority of fresh water usage goes into agriculture. That's where it is. And so the United Nations estimates that 70% on average is used for agriculture. And it takes between 2,000 and 500 liters of water to produce a person's daily food allowance. And that's people who are, eating within. When we look on top of that at all of the other factors we've talked about on the show with the rise in obesity levels, that doesn't even count for those excess calories people are consuming.
100%. And I think last year I was driving through California, and it's almost cliche to bring up almonds in this conversation because I think everybody understands how bad that is. But I think until you actually drive through that region and see how much of a desert it really is, and then look at the irrigation systems, and we're not talking drip irrigation and targeted water use. We're talking about flooded irrigation systems to make almonds grow in a desert. It really became just like seeing it made it like the intellectual side of it, sure, but you can't deny it. It is physically a symbol of our silliness right there. The other one, it's funny, I actually started that morning driving through the almond groves of California, and I ended that drive in Las Vegas. So I got to see the growing of a garden in the desert as the polar examples to start my day of how much water we waste in the pursuit of just doing it the way we've been doing it.
And I think along those same lines, we actually had a whole episode on avocados. Again, you don't have targeted irrigation with that like you can with crops, where it's much more specialized. And the water advancements in technology for crop growing has, especially for countries that can afford this, this has really helped a lot to reduce water usage. But when you look at things like you're actually trying to get trees to grow, and if you're trying to get them in places where they're not meant to grow, or certainly not at the yields that are and monoculturing, right? It's end up being a huge waste of water.
No, and I think it's a great point. And you look at, I think a country that's done really well on looking at their water use because they have to and they have the money to is Israel. A really great examples of some of their agricultural systems because there was no choice. And I think that one of the problems in the global north and especially in North America is that even though the pressures are starting to be there, we don't think about it as actually being an immediate pressure in our lifetime. So any change seems to be disruptive rather than like forestalling a problem, right? And that's, in Canada here, we have 20% of the world's freshwater reserves. It is like the largest concentration of water in any one country. But at the same time, we have indigenous communities across the country that don't have potable and fresh water. We have southern Alberta, even with irrigation, facing drought conditions every year. So it's a weird just tale of duality almost, right? Like we're facing the pressures now, but we gloss over them because there's enough there that we kind of think it's still working. And so I think we're almost in a worse place than the countries that are actually facing the immediate pressures now because they've recognized the problem. They can start to do things to over time, hopefully mitigate some of these and put solutions in where I feel like we, and at least in Canada and America, are barreling towards a problem with blinders on.
Well, I think not only that, I think also Europe, right? Because the same sort of like for a long time have been really spoiled that you have these water resources available. And also, I think another thing that goes along with this is every sustainability issue we talk about, because people in the global north who are more affluent have other ways to cope with these issues. And so and now actually Israel is in fact a global north country. However, they're still sitting in a desert, and they're in a global north country because the United States support after the Cold War and the various other factors for a different show, but entirely different topic show. But when it comes to there are very few countries that are like, so Israel's one. Singapore, also a newly global north country that faces a lot of water issues. But when you start to look at the other global north countries, they're not facing that same imminent sort of path toward water shortages that those two countries are, and the emerging economies and the global north, the rest of the global south countries, more or less.
Yeah, no, and it goes to, I think it's the visibility of it, right? And in those countries that you just named, there's not a way to really put the blinders on. Whereas I think that, again, because of how much water we're importing, right, from these countries into ours to make up for that deficit, because for majority of citizens, you turn the tap water on and it's there. But I don't want to gloss over that we have water access issues in North America for fresh water. I think, everybody knows the example of Flint, Michigan and the poisoning there. Actually, there was a massive investigative reporting done. It was a partnership between, I believe, 4 journalistic organizations in Canada that looked at the amount of lead pipes in our cities because it was not being aggregated and reported on, and found massive, like cities had done basically what they had to, just so like the first line taking out lead, and then said that it was on citizens or the actual distributor for the rest. So found out that we still have a massive lead problem with all of our water, right? And it's one of those things that you turn the tap on, it looks clear. And I think that covers up so many of these issues.
Well, and also the fact that as of in 2022, 2.2 billion people worldwide just didn't have access to potable water. And 3.5 billion people lack access to adequate sanitation services. And rapid urbanization in a lot of these places where these are already problems is just going to exacerbate the issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then that rapid urbanization, think back to some of our earlier episodes on how much water is used on some of these construction products. In our sand episode, we were talking about how much they're taking out to build up these cities. Well, one of the other things you add into that concrete is actually water. Like it's used throughout so many of these processes. And so you got stress from population, stress from agriculture, stress from rapid expansion. What is not putting stress on water as a resource at this point?
Well, and half of the world's population experiences severe water scarcity at least part of the year. And so even if it's not year-round thing, maybe it's just part of a country that where this is happening. Or it's because of the wildfires or various other things that have now depleted water sources. A quarter of the world's population faces extremely high levels of water stress, and over 80% are stressing about how they're going to renew their freshwater supplies. And so when it comes to global north versus global south, which is always sort of my approach to the world, is in the global north, it's low water quality due to agricultural runoff. That's one of the biggest problems because sewage for livestock and farming is just not very well regulated in the United States and some other global or other global north countries. For global south, low water quality is due to just poor wastewater management and treatment because they just don't have the infrastructure to be able to deal with this issue.
Yeah. Three things I really want to hit. One, I think we should, like, everybody should stop on that 3.5 billion. And that's half of our planet of population, right? And like a lot of times you say, oh, it's a really big issue, 20 million people. It's a really big issue, a couple 100 million people. We're talking billions of people on the planet facing these problems. And then on the egg runoff, like listeners remember from our organic versus conventional farming issue, like the annual dead zone created in the Gulf of Mexico from runoff through the Mississippi River Valley. Like these are things that we almost just know about and expect to happen. Oh, it'll happen. Okay, we have algae blooms across, a quarter of our rivers every year. No big deal. And it goes back, I think, to my framing of what's the biggest issue. Well, it's just going to run away. It's going to go away. It'll be somebody else's problem, and freshwater's coming behind it, right? It's that idea that this is just constantly going to keep fixing itself. And I mean, it's just not. And this is the other thing I want. Sorry, I know I'm being a little all over the place, but you were just, as we're setting the context here, I think everybody remember this is right now. Like a lot of the issues we sometimes talk about are like, okay, how much worse is it going to get in the future? And we're really trying to put in context for people what's coming down the road, right? I think the water one is we're starting from a place of half the world is already facing major pressures and problems. And it's just going to get worse. And that's what makes this such a, I find, energizing issue, but also one of the more daunting ones.
And so just to give some statistics in terms of the EPA in the United States, it's not just rivers that we're talking about. I know you didn't even mean to just exclude it, make it so exclusive just to rivers, but rivers and streams and lakes and ponds and all of these places where people are going out for recreation and actually can get ill. Like 20% of these places in the United States, at least, are contaminated. So if you're just out like on the lake fishing and whatever, eating the fish or out swimming, you risk exposure. And it's because of excess phosphorus and nitrogen and sediment and pharmaceutical levels, a whole entire different topic, right? Bacteria levels and these algae blooms. And so it turns out that only 1/3 of US rivers and streams actually have healthy fish communities. That's scary.
It's incredibly scary. And for me here in Canada, I think a lot about the issues we have with salmon stocks in BC and how just devastated that has been. But also, we've talked about agriculture. I think, some listeners would be surprised at how much industrial contamination is still a major problem.
Especially in global South countries. Yeah,
exactly. And again, going back to that regulation problem, right? When you offload these processes to other countries with less monitoring. And again, not because those countries don't want to monitor. It's because, again, you think about the 150 years we've been building institutions, right, that enable us to do this. And we only have ours because of major problems that happened. And then we fixed it, right? So I think sometimes we put it in a negative light on the global South countries for not doing these things. And we didn't do them till we had to. So I have a lot of grace for that.
It's not even the corporations who are to blame because most corporations don't say, oh, well, we'll go to Mexico so we can exploit the environment there. Because those corporations are actually going to subsidiaries and those subsidiaries they're under a lot of pressure. It's always about like the race to the bottom and they're trying to be competitive. So they need to cut corners. And so they're the ones. And then when you have governments that don't have a lot of tax money coming in because funds are repatriated, various other things going on. They just don't have a big tax base, whatever the reasons. They don't have a lot of money to put into, especially into monitoring. And so we see this problem just sort of being pushed off to wherever it gets shipped out to, and that's where we stop thinking about it.
No, exactly. I think one of the issues of the modern kind of distributed systems is that it makes it so opaque and puts so much distance between you and the problem that even if you can have visibility of the end problem, you can't see the chain of how to stop that and where to go. And I think that it does lead sometimes to a feeling of helplessness, even on my side, when I'm thinking about this through a lot of my work is with corporations that are trying to do sustainable actions, and how to show them where they can even put pressure on is sometimes harder than I think the people might think it is.
The longer the global supply chain, the more like murky it is. It's just really hard to track, no matter what sustainability issue that we're talking about.
Yeah. And going back to your point of like contaminated rivers, I love that we actually used the US numbers for that, because I think that, we highlighted that it is a larger problem in global south. But one of the things I really wanted to reinforce for listeners today, assuming our audience is more North American based, is that this is happening here, that we have these problems here, and that obfuscation, it even happens now. I mentioned in Canada, we've had long-standing issues with boil water advisories on Indigenous communities, or in Northern Alberta, a history for the last 50 years of increased cancer rates downstream from our oil sands facilities. And these are issues that, because they affect a marginalized community and such a small percentage, I think we push off and think more about, and at least here in Alberta, we talk a lot about the drought conditions for farmers, but don't talk about the contamination issues for communities.
And when you look at the most recent UN report on this, on biological oxygen demand measures that are used for organic matter, particulates in water, the biggest contributing factor is from the livestock and aquaculture farming. And so livestock produces 85% of the world's sewage waste versus 15% by all humans on the entire planet, right? So we're looking at the gigantic, overwhelming proportion coming from livestock production. And I mean, we have increased water quality pollution. It's getting worse in the global south countries, especially because now they have more people to feed and there's more livestock production there, more people also in emerging economies who have more buying power, who have more demand for meat. So we've got that. And so there's an expectation of an increase from 1.1 to 2.5 billion people being affected by more water contamination and pollution by 2050. So when you look at that, coupled with something like the rate of losing fresh water, higher than and that goes back to what you said at the beginning, right? Higher than it's the rate that it's being replenished. That's what sustainability is about. The fact that we have managed to basically get ourselves into a hole, because it's not that the planet can't renew these resources. It's just that we're outpacing how quickly. So we've borrowed into the future by far. The same with fresh water. And so we take that, looking at contamination and pollution, coupled with rising sea levels. Because then you've got brackish water mixing because of the increased salinization of groundwater, decreasing freshwater availability, coastal areas. And then you see especially in the United States, it makes sense that we've got more people moving to nice places that like Las Vegas, and I wouldn't want to live there, but there are people who want to live there. And all of these places that have water deficits, we talked about this with sustainable cities many episodes ago too. And states like in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nebraska, California, where also with California, you've got the agriculture. And so you've got these places sucking up water. And so that means that water has got to come from somewhere, and it's not coming from, they don't have enough water in those places to meet demand.
No, exactly. And I think you just did a really great job of highlighting the interconnectedness of all these issues. Because I think that episodes we've already done that touch on this, right? Meat and non-meat alternatives. As you mentioned, agriculture and avocados, down to some of the construction stuff and cities, Water, I mean, at the end of the day, oxygen, water, like those are and calories. They're fundamental to life. We need them. We have to solve for them. And I think that when you start thinking through this issue and seeing how water dry, like end decision is us, building the way we want, we grow the way we want. But those decisions are driving down the water resource, and eventually that is going to break down the rest of this integrated system, whether or not we want to.
You throw in land too, right? Because we need somewhere to live. You add in the extreme weather conditions and situations that we've talked about in a previous episode. You've got like all of these issues that we're confronting. And what are we doing about it?
Well, right now we are selling water. That's what we're doing about it. And bottled water. When's the last time you bought a bottle of water, Kimberly?
Traveling overseas where the water just wasn't potable. That's it for me. Like that's it. And I do the best I can to try to avoid doing that when possible. It can be really difficult though.
I was going to say, for listeners, I asked that question so that Kimberly couldn't ask me because I thought we should have the better answer.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
But it really is a major issue around the world, because especially you consuming that in a country without potable water, right? I'm not going to say anything about that. Me or somebody like me grabbing a bottle of water because it's convenient instead of walking to a fountain 5 feet away, that's silly. I don't know.
And carrying a bottle so that you can refill it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I have to say that while I was teaching in talking about this issue, people would be really, really sort of bashful about, and they would be really embarrassed that they would have a water, like a plastic water, to the point on their desk, to the point where people say, well, I'm refilling this. This is just one I have today, and I'm just refilling this one. And I was, I have problems with obviously anything that's sort of like some takeoff fad commercial product. But the Stanley cups, like these thermos cups, have really taken off. And that's something that actually encourages people to want to, for status reasons. That commodity fetishism can work to our advantage in this way. Maybe refill that Stanley thermos you had to have.
I worked with a colleague who was the most most evangelical reusable water bottle person, and she had her brand, and if you just mentioned water, she was out to tell you how this was the best water bottle you can buy, to the point where like we thought maybe she was getting some sort of partnership deal. But you're right, no, it was just like, everybody should have this, and this is the very best one. And the fun part of this is I caved and ended up buying one. But
you needed to carry it around, because I was gonna say, I will send you one if you don't have one that you can carry around with you.
I have my reusable water bottle and coffee cup that I do try very hard to use. I have all my travel stickers on my water bottle. That was my way of reminding me that there's fun out there. But watching that social change of, I think, like 15, 20 people in an org of like 60 people ended up getting one of these water bottles because one person was so passionate about it and wanted to show. And I think that it's just such a great example of when you're looking for changes in your life, sometimes it's just being unashamed about how excited you are by little things.
Oh, that's me in the water bottles for sure. And that's the thing, is that with bottling water, that's an issue that a lot of people don't consider, where that water actually came from. So Fiji water actually comes from the island of Fiji, which means it's made a trip across the ocean to give you drinking water that you can get in a global north country out of a tap. And in most cases, the tap water in most places in developed countries is actually less likely to be contaminated by 1/3 than bottled water is. That's actual studies that have been done. And it's because fresh water, like through the EPA or whatever, the sanitation facilities are far more highly regulated than bottled water is. And so they're more likely to have contaminants in them. And so there was a huge debate in the 1990s. This was really big. I don't know if you weren't even alive probably, but the Great Lakes water shed, that there was a big controversy of whether water should be taken out of the United States, Canada region to sell to Asia. And it was huge, got a lot of publicity and a lot of debate over whether or not it was about proprietary water and ownership, and why, if it's just fresh water and we in the world need it and other places need it, why not use that? And so there was the pro side, which is it's a valuable commodity sell. How is this any different from any other commodity? The other side is, but yeah, this is something that's ours. We really want to get rid of this. We'll end up looking like the RLC.
No, exactly. And I think the weird thing people don't realize, in one of my previous careers, I did a lot of, I worked for material handling companies. So we did a lot of stuff in warehouses and industrial facilities. I have been inside the like major bottling hubs in Calgary and Edmonton for bottled water companies. And it's one company that handles the branded work for 4 different major brands that everybody here has bought. And it is tap water from the city that goes into those bottles, and then we go and buy it with all of that extra waste and all of that. So again, Fiji's a great example of something you're buying that product from Fiji. And that raises an interesting side conversation of restricting global south countries from like selling some like this. We get into this with Fiji and water or natural gas development in some island countries, right? Like it's not great, but do you restrict that? But for us here buying name brand water, you're buying tap water that was bottled usually within the state beside you or a city around you.
I don't know if Dasani is still bottled river water from Detroit or not, but I know for a long time that was the thing. Like it's just Detroit river water that's been processed, and it's not anything more special. In fact, you have worse chance of actually getting contaminated because it's been bottled than if you just drank it straight out of the river. Well, not the river, but after being processed from the river.
I wonder why that was never used as the marketing campaign for it.
Yeah, right.
No, and it gets to also, I think, the inequality of trade. I think this is a great example of it at a base level, right? We have, even there, I said, is it okay for us to stop, a country like Fiji from selling it? But really, they're selling it because we've created the demand for it. And so it creates just a really negative feedback loop, right? Where there's no good way to stop it. You hurt an economy, but really it's us removing a resource from their country that's going to lead to long-term impacts for this short-term financial incentive. And that I really did like Fiji water when I was younger. I did like the whole kind of mythos of it, but it's something that I just now can't support as a consumer because I feel that ethical problem there, right? That they don't have the power to stop this because of the system, and I'm the one driving that.
And there are different types of fresh water, right? And bottled water is blue water. That's surface and groundwater resources from lakes, rivers, aquifers, whatever that's extracted. And this can be used for irrigation. It can be used to bottle up and ship out of the country for that matter. There are others, though. There's green water. And green water is that rainwater that's stored in soil moisture that's used by plant storing growth. So any country that exports food is basically exporting water through green water. There's also gray water. Some places use this where sanitation facilities are available. Hawaii is a state that does this. Instead of, for some reason, they managed to put the infrastructure in place. The problem is, for places that are developing their infrastructure now, it would make sense just to do this. For places that have already antiquated that need to be replaced, again, but it requires having 2 pipes because one that goes, it's water that ends up being potable water. The other is gray. Most stuff like doing the laundry, stuff like that doesn't require like that level of sanitation that's potable. Or if it comes from your wash or it comes from you washing your car, which you should do, but cars need to be washed. I know, but take it to a car wash where they've got a place where the water is recycled and so forth. So again, speaking of water, right?
Yeah, no, but I think gray water is an interesting one because 100% we should have systems to better integrate it back into our systems. And there's lots of ways it can be used. Here I live in Calgary, Alberta. And last year we had I believe the pipe that brought in about 25 to 30% of our water supply burst. So this caused almost a 3-month rebuilding process and forced a 30-40% reduction in water use because of problems across the rest of the system. And everybody in Calgary really found out really quickly what you can do with gray water and how important gray water is. And it's one of those, you never want to have bad moments like that, and it caused a lot of pressure. And I know there was a lot of negative harm. But since then, I have a garden out front, and I just went on vacation for that, and I had my father showering with buckets for his 2-minute shower of the day to keep going, but with buckets in there so that we could still kind of water the plants. And since then, thinking through some of the ways I can use dishwater, some of the ways I can use some of the water that is not good for human consumption anyway and would go down the drain, but why not actually go and water my indoor plants with it? Why not use this for a secondary use and just try to, it's like anything else. Sustainability at the end of the day is just living in balance, right? So what can I do to give this an extended life and use more of it before finally putting it off as a waste product?
And especially the water at that point is so diluted with the particulates that it's not going to harm the plants, and using biodegradable soap is a good thing too. And so if you do that also, then you're definitely not going to harm your plants.
No, and I just for reference, no, you're definitely not going to harm your plants. And like a lot of amazing off-grid systems actually using plants and like we're not talking about it today, but like wetlands are literally some of the we've lost 50% of global wetlands, and that's actually one of my biggest concerns. But I think that's an entire show by itself because of how central plant cleaning in the water supply is. So if you're worried about your plants at all, no, as Kimberly said, biodegradable soap, you're fine, and you've got a second use of that water.
Well, and we've got following up on that, just climate change, the effect that climate change has had on freshwater distribution. Only 0.5% of the world's water supply is fresh water in liquid form. Like that's mind blowing when I hear this statistic. Only 0.5% of the world's water supply is fresh water in liquid form. The rest is either salt water or frozen into glaciers. It's just wow, every time I see that statistic. And so now it's getting worse because we've got more droughts, more severe droughts. We've got flooding, more severe flooding. We've got less snowfall in places where we need to have those frozen layers, and that's melting off too quickly. We've got melting glaciers. We've got melting polar ice caps. We've got ice breakers going through and breaking up what is already there, making it more difficult for it to refreeze if it even possibly can. And so, I mean, that's a win for capitalism because now the shipping routes are shorter between Asia and Europe, and you get more stuff there, right? Talk about paradoxical.
Yeah. You know what's scary about that? You talked about drought, flooding, less snowfall, and melting glaciers. So again, I know I'm referencing like where I'm from a lot today, but in the last 15 years, my city has faced every single one of those.
Wow.
On an actual like major level. So drought surrounding area, not so much the city itself, but farmland in Alberta, a lot of it is facing drought conditions. And if we didn't have the irrigation, would already be in drought. My city had a once in 100-year flood that is happening quicker than but like our entire downtown wiped out. Less snowfall every single year. We look at the snowpack less and less, and what that is not just doing. We think about it in terms of water and runoff, but then it also has knock-on effects to crops and to our lake systems and to those river systems. And then finally, in Alberta, there's the Athabasca Glacier. It's massive. It's something iconic. People come to see. I've never seen it in my life because I remember my mom showing me a picture of her where it was when she was a kid. And now they have it, and they show the sign.
As much as receded, yeah.
And you have to keep walking back into it. And it was just, I remember like being 16 and deciding I'll never see it. It makes me too sad to think about how much it's gone in our lifetime. So these, again, I said it earlier in the show, we talk about all these problems usually as future ones, but we just listed the problems from climate change and water. And I'm living through every one of these in a really well-developed global north country too, right?
So along those lines, another thing that you didn't mention is not outside of crops, but also the economy because of the tourism economy. And that has that twofold again, that sort of, well, on the one hand, if more people see it and appreciate it and want to go and see it, maybe there's more of an incentive to conserve it. On the other hand, the more people who go there to go and see it, right, are contributing to that factor. And I actually had I was in Argentina and went to a glacial field and I saw this huge bit getting ready to chip off and fall in. And I was like, oh. But it turned out that this was one of the few glacial fields in the world that is not actually diminishing. So that was okay. It was part of that natural process. and it was actually not depleting. And so I actually stood there thinking, wow, this is amazing that I'm getting to see this, because other places I've been, like in Iceland and Finland and so forth, you see like this depletion of snowfalls, depletion of glaciers and so forth. And then I feel even worse for having gotten on a plane to go and see these things. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that would be it's the challenge of trying to live a life in these times too, right? And thinking through those actions. So let's bring this back to, pressure on people, and I think for that potable water is the big one, right? People, again, we need water to live. What are some of the ways people are facing these challenges? Like, what are the options they have?
well, I mean, the fact that they're rising sea levels, right? You need to do something about this too. Some people think, well, one way we can do this is to take more salt water out of the ocean and use it, to drench on top of forest fires, which is one of the worst things that we do, as we talked about in one of the previous episodes. Also, desalination of water, ocean water. That is scary biscuits, because it is just so resource intensive to be able to pull off. I was hiking in Santorini along the rim, and just happened to walk past. Santorini is an island in Greece where all of their fresh water is imported, because they also have desalination there, but from what I understand, that's more for supplying the daily water that's not for drinking. So all of the water supply, from what I understood, is imported. So they've got heaps and tons and loads of bottles coming in. But they have so I'm hiking along the volcanic rim, and there's this desalination plant just sitting there. It was completely open. There was not a person around. All of the doors were open. I went and I took pictures, because that's just the way I roll. And it was shocked that I didn't see anyone. And after the fact was thinking, wow, like somebody could go in and sabotage that, and it would bring down the island, like at least part of the island, because it was right by it was on the way to the kind of main city, where all of the cruise ships dock, and the city is just completely overrun. And so the hiking was the good part. The city visit was just overwhelming. And so desalination, though, is really bad, because you've got it requires a lot of energy. And this goes for other things too. Some of these other alternate sources, like, okay, importing water, exporting water is also resource intensive, right? Plus then you add the plastic to that. Moving icebergs is another thing. Also, tapping into melting glacial waters by putting in pipelines to tap that. So we have these sorts of things. Asteroids is the most sort of literally out of the world solution. So we talked about outer space, and here's another way how we're looking to outer space to solve our Earth human created problems. All of these things are very resource intensive. They require a lot of energy to do, to process. You have to have facilities to do this. They're not generally sustainably, I mean, unless it's wind or nuclear or whatever, but these are also things that could be used for other sources, not decontaminating salt water, when we have other options that are more viable than this. And also, like, what do you ever think about what happens to all that salt that's been extracted? Because what ends up happening is, and I've seen this in Singapore, they have big giant tubes that then run out into the water, and they do it a little further out, but all of those loads of brine end up. So that's increasing the salination level of the water. So imagine what that does to the immediate biodiversity in that area. So unless they spread it over large areas, it ends up causing dead zones. It's also really high cost. It'd be like, it's just so bad. All these things are such bad ideas.
I think it's a great point. And, for somebody listening, you're thinking about like Israel does desalination. Oh, you got one country doing it. What's wrong with it? Again,
Jordan does it too. And Egypt does it too. When you start looking at all the other countries that do it. Yes, Jordan. Oh, yes, sorry.
No, I rarely get to make that joke, so I'll use it. No, and then that was the point I was driving at, is then go back to the numbers: 3.5 billion people with access to endangered water with some problems in it. Again, 99% of our water in salt water or in water, fresh water that is trapped in some way. So to actually convert the system over to desalination, I think that sometimes when these ideas sound really great to people at the high level, you got to think through what this would mean implemented for everybody. And then we're not talking, you can't spread it out enough to, avoid the dead zone issues. The one that you didn't mention, and I want to because it's my favorite water method, is some of the water humidity nets.
Oh yeah, or billboards. Yes, I was going to say that. That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not a scalable or a solution, right? So that's why it is not even in the top 10. But if you ever want to see some really amazing community-based projects, that's where I think those really shine, is in the specific locations where they can do it. It is just really cool, like human thing to see giant, basically almost like fishing line nets that are up there that collect water droplets and feed it all down from just the morning fog going through. So really cool, but not scalable.
Well, I've actually, when I was this is how much of an important an issue it is to Jordan, the country, because it is also mostly desert, right? And Amman, the capital city, which is completely overpopulated, they have huge issues with fresh water as well and supply. And that's another thing. A lot of people think, well, it's Amman, it's a capital city, it's an emerging economy. How can they possibly have water issues? Well, people there, in like a lot of other emerging economies and capital cities in developing countries, have poly tanks, and they have to buy water, because even if the city provides water, even if they have that whole sanitation thing set up, they don't necessarily have reliable water, and they may not even have enough water to get through from month to month or throughout the year. And so people end up having to buy water, and that water is imported from somewhere too. So when I was there, I was in the museum in Amman, and they had a whole section about sustainability and farming, because they do farming too. And so you've got that, and you've got the need to replenish water supplies. And that was one of the cool things, the nets with the water, just collecting water and moisture that's in the air. And there's one in Lima, Peru also. I mean, this is a city that when I visited, it sounds like Kimberly's travels today. When I visited, they had people would build up their houses in the cities, and they wouldn't even bother. It didn't matter if they put roof on it or not, because they got so little fresh rainwater throughout the year that it rained so infrequently that it didn't matter if they had a roof. So they would just do some more construction when they could afford to do it, and they would just build up. It was really wild. But that's one place where, if you've got billboards anyway, if they also have the billboards that can collect this water, then fantastic. But as you mentioned, it's not scalable, because that's just not something. What is, though, and what is my favorite, is the toilet to tap. And that's not anybody's favorite, because it's got this just ick factor.
It's anything to do with waste, especially human waste, just triggers something so old in our brains, right? Like it's not even working against any sort of modern, misinformation or anything. You're actually working against something inside of your deep brain.
It's that innate, right? That innate human instinct to survive. That means you avoid that.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so I smiled when you said it, right? Because it is, one of the best options. Or even countries and locations that have been able to like separate gray water streams. And this happens in rural areas a lot more, where you can separate out your, 75% of your gray water that doesn't have, too much human waste, and reuse that in different ways on your property. Or I didn't know about the Hawaii example of actually building that into their infrastructure, right? But I think that's what this really gets to, is that the only scalable solution is major infrastructure. Like that is the only way to deal with water, right?
Because that's the way we get rid of the lead that contaminates the water. It's the way that we be able to put, and while you're doing that, why not put in dual system pipes to be able to collect gray water and transport gray water? And a lot of this just comes down to the fact that a lot of people just don't think about water in developed countries, because you turn on the tap, as I said at the onset, you turn on the tap and the water comes out, and you don't only think about it when the water doesn't come out, or when it looks off color, or maybe if it tastes funny, or you go somewhere else, you're traveling and it tastes funny, right? Because the different treatment or whatever. And so there's this resistance. I have taken students for my sustainability class, I've taken them to the Cincinnati Waterworks. And yes, and it is a really fascinating place to visit. And one of the things every single time the tour guide would say is, You can't tax water. You can't raise taxes on water. It's so difficult. Nobody wants to pay for more water. And they don't even make enough to actually run the plant. What they're charging is undercharging for what they really need to be doing. And so that extra money has to come from somewhere. And that goes also to the point that the poorest people in the world pay the most for water because a lot of times they don't actually have these public works that have been put in place because they never had the money to build them up. And so entrepreneurs go in and they try to do it, but they don't end up making enough money because of all of the upfront costs that you need. And so then you just have people who just don't have fresh water.
No, and I think that really highlights the two separate problems right now. I think global north is a problem of an old system that we've built up and not wanting to change it. And going back to, people think of it as a right. It is my right to have water. I've always had water. And frankly, I just think that everyone in the global north country would see it as a failure. And again, when Flint hits the news, we see it as a failure of our civilization that we haven't done this, right? So we're stuck with that and not being able to change, I think, because of that path dependency. I often think on some of these issues, global south countries, developing countries have an advantage of not having the infrastructure in a way because they can build a better version, but are trapped by that lack of capital, right?
Yeah.
So we have capital and don't want to change it. They don't have capital and want to build better. And both are stuck in a system that's not really working for anybody.
Well, and so many of these places that are cities around the world, whether they're emerging economies or global south developing economies, I was in Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar. And sure, I stayed in a hotel and it had running water and so forth. But when you go out into the city, you see public taps because people don't have sanitation. They don't. They use outhouses. They use public toilets. This is the same. I mean, Delhi in India, they have public toilets because there just aren't enough people who are living in places that have public sanitation. You see public water, like in Antananarivo, they've got taps in the wall. There are jerry cans sitting everywhere where people just go because they share the cans because they need to, and they just take it back and forth to their house. And then when it's empty, they don't need it. They're on their way to the market to pick up they just take the can back. And then the next time they're there, and there are just a whole bunch of them sitting there. And this is the same in India. Everywhere I was in India, just water trucks everywhere, delivering water to people. And it's just, this is the level of the problem that exists because most places just don't have the money for the infrastructure for this, or even if the infrastructure is in place, they don't have the money to expand it to accommodate the rapid urbanization.
No, exactly. And I think, think of the India example. I know in our sand episode, we talked about some of the pressures there leading to the loss of rivers and people who their choices led from having full water access to having water trucks be brought in, right? And a couple years. So again, just sometimes we think these change so over such a long period of time, but it really can happen quickly. And the other thing about the climate change, I just because kind of thinking about water use here for a second, is the pressure on agriculture is as it's getting hotter and where we're growing, it's just driving up more and more demands. So as we've gone through this episode, I want to throw it to you and say kind of what can we do? Where are we going? Because I have just kept hitting the road of this is getting worse, Kimberly.
Yeah. And I mean, I was really excited by Singapore's approach. It's a micro state. It's got water security issues because it's dependent on water coming from Malaysia. They have really good relations with Malaysia, so they're okay. But just in the event, right, that's not going to be okay, they also want to be more independent. They have the money to do this. So they started this new water treatment. It's actually NEW water. It's like an acronym for their new water, whatever. And that was a really cool thing they did because so they did this whole huge campaign to get people on board with toilet to tap water. But it turns out their water is so purified. They actually use it for their microchip industry and also for industry, even though they got the public on board with this. It is such potable water that that's not even what they give to the people. They still refine the whatever river water and whatever they've got coming through. And then they use that because it's such high quality, but they've got the infrastructure in place, right? So they've got that there. If they need to give people water, they've got it. Also, I think what New York City did was actually a really good thing too, which was In the 1980s, they were confronted with not being in line with the U.S. Safe Water Drinking Act. And so their water was all coming from upstate, the Catskills, and also in Jersey, the Delaware watersheds. And so what they did was they realized it was going to cost $3 to $6 billion to actually put infrastructure in place in New York City to purify water. But what they did instead was they invested at the time $60 million to put ecosystem services in place that invested in the farming, invested in the watershed areas, put paved, road surfaces near the watershed, set up buffer zones, and invested in the reservoirs and stream channels. And also one of the big things they did, because those are big farming areas, obviously they've got a lot of water, big farming areas, was to prohibit the use of manure within 500 feet of the watersheds. And so that way, then this ended up being a win-win-win because they got the local farmers on board saying, oh, you're taking our water? What? But they're investing in that. They're investing in the farming, in their infrastructure. They're being paid for this. Their quality of life isn't decreased because they're losing water. And New York City got off way cheaper than if they would have had to do this on their own. So again, it's about the infrastructure. And the New York City example actually demonstrates that it's possible to do this far less expensively than if you were trying to do this just to let's start and do it in our own city on our own.
No, I think it's such an amazing example. And because so often we're talking about cost externalities from the environment or from actions, right? That you're not. And I think this is the flip side of that. Ecosystem services are the benefit side of the equation that we don't account for, right? And in a lot of cases, we're drawing from it. And, I mentioned wetlands earlier in the episode. And I think that this is one of the key features that they actually do is act as buffers during flooding events, processing groundwater and working in that system. So to see 3 to 6 billion, and I mean, it was a government project, capital project. So, 12 billion down to 600 million, the end number probably would have been, is just so amazing. And really, I know we have some other examples, but very rare for a North American case. We often, if I account for ecosystem services in any way, it's usually as oh, good, it's doing that and we don't have to. I really like that there was a value placed on it that could actually be put back to communities, because you have to get a way for those communities to buy in. Because at the end of the day, like you said, water's a right. So people just seeing the water coming isn't the value to them. That's the expectation. And I think that this is such a great example of actually building up the groups you need, the kind of stakeholder awareness, and then implementing it and seeing that return. Honestly wish we had more of this across the countries.
Well, and there are a few things. One is that this is the same for any place where conservation is expected to happen. So if we're talking about rainforests or mangroves, which we should do an episode on mangroves, right? We talk about any sort of thing where you want people to actually take care of that. We're usually talking about people in developing countries and they're dependent on this, but they also don't have a lot of alternatives. So even if of course they don't want to destroy, like you were saying earlier, you don't want to destroy the land where you are. You don't want to destroy it, but sometimes you're left with no other choice. So you need to have an alternative. And if you are a stakeholder in a different way who's actually being compensated for that, then of course you're going to have more of an incentive because your quality of life is also going to improve from this sort of investment. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing too, though, for the New York City example was they were sort of over a barrel. They needed to do something. And so again, with water as this sort of invisibility issue, a lot of places aren't thinking in that sort of projecting sort of way, a planning sort of way. And where we all have also seen, like in Latin America with water trust funds to conserve lands and protect watersheds, most of them have been put in place by NGOs, and most of them are city targeted. And it's not on not country scale, not a large scale. It's looking at communities and trying to help various communities and so forth. So, it's when it comes to
Yeah, well, so sorry to jump in. It's just one of the things that's making me really excited here, though, on the nerdy side, is the work in the last, it's been going on for 50 years, but really the last 15 years, it's accelerated on economics, like the actual economists' recognition and models around ecosystem services and understanding how to account for those, as well as then the task force on nature related disclosure. Like, I know these things are never get known by anybody, but like they actually end up driving a lot of corporate behavior and reporting. And I think that it seems like such a small thing, but being able to even just properly name, label, and track these aspects allow us to bring it into the system. Part of that unawareness is that willful blindness. And then part of it is just if we don't have a way to quantify it and put it into terms we understand, I think people just kind of, okay, that's somebody else's problem then, because what can I do?
Well, and that's the thing is that, like, for example, with Cincinnati, the government ends up subsidizing the water production and sanitation rather than the actual users paying for that. So eliminating subsidies would be a really good way to start. Take that money, pay more for it, make people pay. But then, that's not a really popular thing for anybody who's involved. The consumers, it's not popular for the politicians. The city doesn't want the backlash. So they just sort of suck it up and deal with it. But properly priced water would help consumers. And in places where there are water shortages, sure, this is something that people are much more aware of, that they are much more keen on knowing what their water bill is, what they've been taxed, if there's water, if they've been billed improperly, or if it's, like we noticed that there must have been a water leak because suddenly our water bill was higher. And so that's when people pay attention.
Yeah, no, and I think that there's, because generally I don't think either of us are going to be elected to elected office anytime soon.
I'm not.
But I think there's actually a really interesting, easy kind of awareness campaign on this that should be taken, in global north countries that have both the data and the ability, is show your water consumers how much of their tax dollars go to it. Because you think you're not paying for it, but a subsidy is coming from us anyways. And I think getting your water bill at the end of the month, and it was, your $30 for your water bill, but thank you for the $182 of your taxes that went to this. I think that would actually, even as a way of showing the full cost to the consumer, right, would be a way.
I would say in one of the other episodes, we were talking about how some places actually show comparisons to what your neighbor's bill was. I mean, wouldn't that be great to see? Oh, here's the tax amount that's going to your bill, and here you're subsidizing your neighbor who's out there watering their lawn every single day.
Yeah, I think, and those are, we talked last week, politics and economy and culture, and I think this is a great way to sometimes stepping out of the, okay, this is big, this is complicated. How can we start using some social, not pressure, but social awareness to mobilize? And that's what I think of this as, right? Because again, it's you alone in your home. That's the great stuff about that research that shows that it still has an impact, is because no one sees you open that letter and see that comparison and see how much it's costing you. But we know that drives change.
Well, and I think one of the biggest problems for global South countries is just lack of ownership rights and extraction rights. And that's something, too, that if there was more data about what was actually happening, the effect, and how more could go back, and it could be a win-win-win, like the situation with the watershed that's the watersheds that feed New York City, that would also make a difference.
Well, with that tracking, you could then actually look at the cost you're charging those companies and the cost that go into our goods, right? So if I'm still in a perfect system, we'll still have water footprints being moved around the globe. That'll still happen. But I think what would make it a perfect system is actually having the accounting of it, so that we know and we're adequately compensating the countries, so that those countries are actually making the best decision too. Going back to my Fiji question, should we put pressure on a country not to sell it? Well, if that water was being charged for what the actual loss of that water means to Fiji, and they still want to sell it, and a consumer still wants to buy it, then I have no sustainability issue with that at all, because we're actually looking at the full impact of it. And I think that if there's one thing to kind of take away from this today, is that we rarely look at the full impact of water.
Yeah, I agree. Good. So I think that wraps up our discussion for freshwater for the day. If you enjoyed our episode of Sustainable Planet, or even if you didn't, let us know at splanetpod@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll find these links in our show notes on our website, splanetpod.com, along with additional resources from today's episode. You can also read on my Substack post more about sustainability. We'd really appreciate it if you rate and review Sustainable Planet on your podcast app. And thanks for listening and have a sustainable day.